Ephraim Heiligser made Aliyah to Israel 22 years ago. He was 18 years old. He's my son. And he went to study at 18 and he joined the IDF and he was a lone soldier. He studied at Birchat Moshe Hester Yeshiva in Ma'ale Adumim. And his Rosh Yeshiva was Rabbi Rabinovich. And he also studied under Rabbi Sabato, who won the Israel Prize in Literature. You may have read some of his books. He served in the infantry as a soldier in the Golani Brigade. Ephraim is presently a partner at the law firm of Pearl Cohen Law Firm and a doctoral candidate at Columbia Law School, and he does patent law. I'm very proud to be his mother. He's a wonderful son. He married an Israeli dentist, and she's just finished her fellowship. I'm very proud of Shimrit, and God bless her. And so he's raising his family in Israel, and he's going to talk to us about making Aliyah and his path to that on that journey and how it intersects with some very unusual things. Your turn, Ephraim.
Can we show the short clip of Rabbi Sachs? Okay, and then you will unmute yourself. Françoise, can you show the film of Rabbi Sachs that I sent you?
Right away.
Not right now. I would do that in a minute.
It's just three minutes long. It'll set the tone.
Okay. I think it would be better to do it maybe in 2 minutes.
Oh, okay. Okay, Françoise, you'll take the cue from Ephraim.
Sure. Thank you. Okay. I would like to begin by saying that that myself, Rabbi Sachs, and the all of Israel have a lot to thank Montreal for. And what we want to thank what we have to thank Montreal for is for giving us Rabbi Nachum Eliezer Rabinovich. Rabbi Sachs wrote a eulogy for him, which I will read to you. Then we can hear a little bit about Rabbi Sachs's Rabbi Rabinovich, who I was also lucky and blessed to be one of his students as well. So for the last Rabbi Dr. Nachum Rabinovich was 92. He was a scholar in Talmudic law, wrote a multi-volume commentary on Maimonides' Code of Law, the Mishnah Torah, and was a living embodiment of Torah Umada, Torah and science. For the last 38 years of a long and active life, he was the head of the Hesder Yeshiva Birkat Moshe and Ma'ale Adumim, and was widely recognized as one of the leading scholars in religious Zionist community. He developed a bold approach to Jewish law and was especially encouraging of the role of women as halakhic advisors. His combination of Jewish knowledge, familiarity with a broad range of secular disciplines, human sensitivity, psychological realism, and moral courage made him an exceptional exponent of Jewish law. Born in Montreal in 1928, he began studying Talmud with Montreal's chief rabbi, Rabbi Pinchas Hirschberg, at the age of 14. In 1948, he enrolled in the Ner Yisrael Yeshiva in Baltimore, where he studied with and was obtained rabbinic ordination from Rabbi Yaakov Ruderman. He studied mathematics at Johns Hopkins University, where he obtained a master's degree, later completing a doctorate at the University of Toronto on probability and statistical inference in ancient and medieval Jewish literature. While in Baltimore, he met and married his beloved wife, Rachel Shulowitz. From 1951 to 1955, he served as the rabbi of a Jewish community in Dallas, Texas, and then until 1963 in Charleston, South Carolina. Toward the end of this period, he was offered the position of chief rabbi of Johannesburg as a successor to Rabbi Dr. Louis Rabinovich. He declined on the grounds that he could not in conscience live in an apartheid state. In 1963, he accepted the role of rabbi of the Clanton Park Synagogue in Toronto. He also taught mathematics at the University of Toronto and was an editor of Hadarom, the Journal of the Rabbinic Council of America. His particular focus on contemporary issues in Jewish law, and in this field he developed a bold approach to halachic decision-making, which became a notable feature of his later role within the religious Zionist community. His responses are collected in the volumes Melandei Milchama and Siach Nachum. In 1971, he came to London to take up the role as principal of Jews College, Anglo Jewry's rabbinic training center. It is fair, and at Jews College, he was the teacher of Rabbi Sachs. He always wanted to live in Israel, and when the opportunity presented itself to do so, he accepted with electricity. In 1983, he became the head of the Hesder Yeshiva Birkat Moshe in Ma'ale Adumim, which at that time was a very, very small town in the middle of the desert, which over time grew to be much bigger, a big town of 40,000 people around the yeshiva. The yeshiva had been founded 6 years earlier by Rabbi Chaim Sabato and Yitzchak Shilat. It is said of Rabbi Sabato that after hearing Rabbi Rabinovich for the first time, he immediately offered him the position. It was there he found immense happiness and fulfillment, taking enormous pride in his thousands of students, both for their intellectual and spiritual achievements and for their courage while serving in the Israeli Defense Forces. And there I was one of his students. Also, unafraid of controversy, in 2015, at the age of 87, he agreed to become the head of Yurak Halacha, the conversion court designed to make the process of conversion easier, especially for children of Russian immigrants. He believed this to be essential to avoid major risks in Israeli society. And as Rabbi Sachs finished in this article he wrote about him, we will miss his wisdom, clarity, and courage. He died just over 1 year ago. So now if you could play the video, we can hear Rabbi Sachs discussing Rabbi Rabinovich's role as his rabbi. It's about 3 minutes long.
Was a giant and still is Rabbi Nachum Rabinovich, who was then head of Jews College. I became his successor and is today head of the yeshiva in Ma'ale Adumim. Now, he was and is an intellectual giant, huge command of the entire rabbinic literature, author of a vast and extraordinary commentary on the whole of Maimonides' Mishnah Torah, and at the same time, proficient in virtually all the sciences, who was a professor of mathematics and probability theory at the University of Toronto. There was almost nothing he didn't know. And he was my personal teacher for 12 years. For those 12 years, we studied together virtually every day. Now, he was and is a man of enormous moral courage and intellectual clarity. And from him, I learned what is the life of Torah. So he would constantly challenge me to learn more and learn more. I once complained to him that I had enormous difficulty getting to sleep at night. I'm an insomniac. And he said to me, "Oh, really? Teach me how to be an insomniac." That's great. I'd love that. Lo nitna laila ela legirsa. He quoted the Gemara that God only created night so that we could have time to study. He envied my inability to sleep. There was one occasion when his car went into the garage to be serviced, and he asked me to give him a lift home. And it was a hot summer's day, and we were in one of the most busy junctions in London at a traffic lights. And when the traffic lights changed from red to green, my car stalled. And this was a very busy junction, and I was causing an enormous tailback. And my teacher turned to me with absolute equanimity and said, "Well, since we're here, we have to learn Torah together." And he then proceeded to give me a most beautiful shiur on Maimonides' Hilchot Shemitah v'Yovel, laws of the sabbatical year. And in the meanwhile, cars were piling up, and they're hooting their horns. And he very calmly reached the end of his exposition, and he said, "And now try the key again." I turned the key, the car started, and off we went. Here was a man who used every single thing that happened to him in his life as an occasion to learn and live Torah. And that is the kind of person you should take as your personal teacher in Judaism.
How beautiful. And this was the man who taught you, Ephraim?
Yes, I was fortunate enough to learn from him as well. Obviously, not at the same level and intensity as Rabbi Sachs, unfortunately, but I was fortunate enough to learn with him. And I think tonight we're supposed to talk. This is the Israel session, I understand, of the
That's right. We're going to talk
of-
about the Jewish land. So if like every session, we start with that little short video on 10 paths to God on that unit. So can I ask Françoise to show that one now? And then we will continue with your
Sure.
presentation. Perfect. Wonderful.
No religion in history has been as closely tied to a land as has Judaism. That connection goes back almost 4,000 years from the first words of God to Abraham: leave your country, birthplace, and your father's house, and go to the land I will show you. No sooner had he arrived than God said, to your offspring I will give this land. 7 times God promised the land to Abraham and promised it again to Isaac and Jacob. The word tshuva, often translated as repentance, literally means homecoming, in a double sense, spiritually to God and physically to the land of Israel. For Israel is the Jewish people's place of destiny, a tiny land for a tiny people, yet one whose role in religious history is vast. It's the land to which Moses and the Israelites traveled across the desert, the land from which they were exiled twice, the land to which our ancestors journeyed whenever they could, and which they never voluntarily left, never relinquished. Jewish history is the story of the longing for a land. The Holy Land remains the place where Jews were summoned to create a society of justice and compassion under the sovereignty of God. And though it was subsequently held holy by Christianity and Islam, the centers of these other faiths were elsewhere. For Western Christians, Rome; for Eastern Christians, Constantinople; and for Muslims, Mecca and Medina. There are 56 Islamic states today, 82 Christian ones, but only one Jewish state. It is the only place on earth where Jews are a majority, where they enjoy self-rule, where they are able to build a society and shape a culture as Jews. The Balfour Declaration in 1917, subsequently ratified by the League of Nations long before the Holocaust, was an attempt to rectify the lingering denial of a nation's right to its land and the subsequent persecution of Jews in country after country, century after century, in a history of suffering that has no parallel. The Jews who returned were not strangers, outsiders, an imperial presence, a colonial force. They were the land's original inhabitants, the only people in 4,000 years who created an independent nation there. All other occupiers of the land, from the Assyrians and Babylonians to the Ottomans and the British, were imperial powers who ruled the land as a district of their vast realms. The Egyptians didn't offer the Palestinians a state when they ruled Gaza between 1948 and 1967. Neither did the Jordanians when they ruled the West Bank during those years. The only nation to have offered Palestinians a state is the State of Israel. And every day we pray for its peace.
Thank you so much, Françoise. Just before I hand it off back to you, Ephraim, I just want to mention that Rabbi Sachs, the first time he understood that his mission in life is probably going to be a rabbi was after 1967, the war. He was shaken to his foundation, and he realized there's something in there, and I don't want it to become one of those who give up my Judaism. I want to find. So he went and met with the Rebbe, and it was then that the Rebbe told him, "You need to go and train other leaders to become leaders," and that's how he became a rabbi. So on to you, Ephraim.
Yes, actually, the beginning of the video we saw, he talks about his meeting with the Lubavitcher rabbi that you talked about. He spoke of three different rabbis, the Lubavitcher rabbi, Rabbi Soloveitchik, and then Rabbi Rabinovich. So I wanted to focus on the personal relationship of a person to Israel. And I wanted to focus on it in the light of Rabbi Rabinovich, who made Aliyah to Israel later in his life, after he'd been very, very successful throughout the Jewish world. He could have stayed a rabbi in Charleston. He was the leading rabbi there. He was a very, very leading rabbi in Toronto during his time there as well. And then at Jews College in London, he was at the top of the British rabbinical establishment. And despite being at the pinnacle in all of these different places, he chose to go to the middle of the desert in Ma'ale Adumim, which was nothing then. Today, you can go to Ma'ale Adumim and see it, and it's 40,000 people. But then the yeshiva was in mobile buildings. There wasn't a building. Now there's a lovely, great, big Beit Midrash in the middle of Ma'ale Adumim, a town of 40,000 people. And this is what he built over 40 years. He didn't come to Israel, and it wasn't as it being easy for him. In the beginning, when he came to Israel, he was in some ways looked at as an outsider. There were Israeli rabbis. He was coming from a different establishment, a different place. And students during that time, when he first came to the yeshiva, which had been established several years before then, describe how it took, in the beginning, they thought he was going to end up going back to London, that he couldn't really assimilate and acclimate into the yeshiva. And then they said all of a sudden, about 2 months after, they saw he became the Rosh Yeshiva, leading the different rabbis, leading the yeshiva forward over the next 40 years and having thousands of students. And the reason I'm telling you this is because I think that that's a fear for many people that think about making Aliyah. They think about it and they say, well, I have a very significant place in my society. I'm able to have a lot of influence in my surroundings. I'm able to do many great things in the place that I am now. And if I pick up and I go to Israel, I go from a place where I can have a lot of influence, do a lot of things, to a place where who knows what influence I can have. And when you look at the story of Rabbi Rabinovich, who came when he was 51 years old and established in all of these other places, and you see him come to Israel and you see his 40 years, it wasn't just in the yeshiva in Ma'ale Adumim. He was one of the leaders of the religious Zionist rabbis in all of Israel. He was respected by all the rabbis in Israel. When he acted, even at 87 years old, on behalf of the conversion courts for the Russian immigrants, that was something that was heard about all over Israel, and it was a very, very big matter. And even at that age, he was still leading for us. So that's one thing I wanted to say. I also wanted to say that even beyond that, you look now today, we have a prime minister who's the son of American immigrants, Naftali Bennett, who came in their 30s and 40s after the 6-Day War. So I think that it's important to understand that Israel is built by the Olim that come, and they can have great influence in Israeli society and help build it and get us to the better place that Rabbi Sachs talked about, to make a more perfect society, a messianic society here in Israel. And every Oleg can be a part of that, and they can be a leader of that. And I also wanted to touch on another point, and that is what drew Rabbi Rabinovich to Israel? What draws us to Israel? Why is Israel important to us? Obviously, the things that Rabbi Sachs says are very, very important. But Israel for us, obviously, I understand not everyone is going to get tomorrow on the plane, on the El Al plane, and come to Israel and make Aliyah. I was fortunate enough to do that in my life. I understand that it's not the easiest thing to do. If you're able to come and help build Israeli society from the inside, I think that would be great. But even if you're not, I think Israel is important for all of Jewry. And the reason is today Jewry in outside of Israel is without the Jewish identity that Israel gives you is sorely lacking. A flourishing Jew needs more as a Jewish identity than remembering the lands where his parents were from, the fear of the Holocaust or anti-Semitism. For us Sephardim, the taste of Tabit or Kuba. For the Ashkenazim, they like cholent. It needs a horizon. You have to have something that you're building, something that you're working towards, something that you're building not just as a single person or as a small community, but has a complete nation. And that's what Israel gives you. And to describe that, I wanted to describe something that happened during Rabbi Rabinovich's time as rabbi of the Clanton Park Synagogue in Toronto. He was the rabbi of the Clanton Park Synagogue after the Six-Day War. And after the Six-Day War, one of his congregants there tells the story that that Israel at that time needed had a significant need for money. They needed money. They needed people to buy bonds, Israeli bonds at that time. So they had a meeting for the synagogue. They had them, I'm sure, all around the Jewish world at that time. And at the Clanton Park Synagogue, they had one as well. And everyone was giving a small amounts, the normal amounts they could. And then all of a sudden, Rabbi Rabinovich comes and gives a fifth of his salary to the Israeli bonds. And you see, because even for the people that are not in Israel, for Jewry that's not in Israel at the time, Israel is a central part of who they are and their identity. And when Israel, we have to give of ourselves in any way we can, even if we're sitting in Toronto, to the building of Israel. And after that, Rabbi Rabinovich termed it at that time that we should have 100% mobility for Israel. Like an army is mobile, ready to go. We as people, even if we're not in Israel, have to be 100% with Israel and giving of ourselves to Israel. And I think that there are many ways that that can be done, even if a person isn't able tomorrow to get on the plane and come and make Aliyah. You can speak, try and start speaking more Hebrew at home. You can make sure that you have a subscription to an Israeli newspaper so you're able to be involved in what's going on in Israel and understand. You can make sure that your foreign trips are all to Israel so you're able to become connected to the land. Very importantly, you can make business connections to Israel as well, to build your business in Israel. So the Israeli economy grows. So if you're able to make eventually Aliyah, you'll already have business interests in Israel as well. Pick an Israeli charity to help so you can give of your money to Israel as well. You can send children to Israeli camps. They have those for teenagers. Spend a gap year in Israel, go to a yeshiva like I did. I think that's a great thing. I also think that it's important from a religious standpoint that we have many laws of the land, particularly now that we're in the book of Dvarim, Deuteronomy, the last book of the Torah, is really very much involved in the land of Israel. and learning about the laws of Israel and the land of Israel and how we connect to it spiritually and religiously is very important. And also, I think for synagogues, for people, for organizations, if you can even have an Israeli night where you learn more about Israel together, where you sit together and do things, I think that all of those are great things that can help bring the connection to Israel that we need for our Jewish identity, even for people that are not in Israel at this time. And doing those things to build yourself. Hopefully, I obviously hope eventually that you're able to join me in Israel and be here with us. But even if you're not, your support, knowing that you're together with us and knowing that Israel is part of your identity is very key for us and for you. And so to conclude, I would like to we look at this week's Parshat Shavua. We see how Moshe was all oriented to Israel. His prayer begins this week's Torah portion of being able to come into Israel. And I pray for all of you that one day you're able to come and join me as well, living in Israel, when it's your time. And until then, you'll be longing to the land. You have the same longing to the land and to coming here and being connected to it as Moshe had when he looked at Israel at the beginning of this week's Parshat Shavua. So I'd like to finish by thanking Montreal for giving me my teacher, Rabbi Rabinovich, for giving him to Israel, to Rabbi Sachs. He made a tremendous impact on me, on Rabbi Sachs, we heard, and on all of Israeli society. Thank you, Montreal.
Thank you so much, Maître Ephraim. If there are any questions from our listeners, it was a very, very moving, very honest and sincere, straight from the heart. You know, rarely do they speak with such clarity. And your mother has that too. Clarity is what I admire about her. And you just say it the way it is. And when I heard you speak, I was thinking of when I was helping my dad write his memoir. And he wrote about how different sayings of the prophets connected and became actual real prophecy in real history and led to the state of Israel. For example, he said, Isaiah says, "Who are these birds that fly to the window?" He says, well, this is an airplane window. And they were bringing the immigrants to the land of Israel. And so I really appreciate hearing you, especially because you're calling us from the land of Israel at 2 a.m. Israel time. And if you want to stay on with us to watch the virtual tour, you're most welcome. If you have to go back to sleep, there's nobody who's going to pull you back. We know that you have 4 beautiful kids and a wonderful wife who's a dentist, and you both work so hard. So we're so grateful that you joined us tonight.
Thank you very much for giving me the honor of joining you tonight and speaking.
Beautiful, beautiful.
Rabbi. I will actually go now because I must go to sleep, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Ephraim.
I just want to say how proud I am of Ephraim. Thank you so much, sweetheart.
Thank you, Mom.
Should be. That was very special. Thank you, Carol. Does anyone have any questions?
Yes, I raised my hand.
Yes.
I was wondering if you can make the link of Rabbi Sachs talking about the land of Israel available through maybe.
Sure, I'll send it to everyone.
Send it to everyone, and I would love to have a copy of that.
Sure.
And thank you for a well-presented and Ephraim Yishar Kocha.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Where do you live?
I live in a town called Niria. It is about 40 minutes from Jerusalem in the area of Modi'in.
Okay. And you settled there immediately and you liked it, or did you have to move around before you found the right place to live?
We've lived in several different places. I've lived here in Neriya for the past 5 years.
Oh, okay.
I would like to thank you for your beautiful presentation.
Yeah.
I lived 18 years in Israel, and I was very touched with your presentation because this reminds me of all my life over there. I got married in Israel, and my 2 children were born in Israel. And I am very attached to Israel. I continued to go every year to Israel until recently. And all my family is there. I have 4 younger sisters they are all grandmothers over there. So when I go there, it's like
Heaven.
the whole,
How
the
about
whole community.
How about also telling us just a little bit about your time at the IDF?
Oh, sure. I was in the Golani Brigade and Infantry Brigade. I served on the Lebanese border. I've served in the reserves for the past 20 years after my initial service. I hope to continue, even though I've reached the age of 40 now, and normally that's the retirement age from the Army, but I hope to be able to continue. I enjoy being able to actually, I think when I'm in the Army, I feel you can actually palpably feel how you're giving of yourself, of your own efforts to Israel, and that's a feeling that whenever I get to put on the green uniform, really touches my heart, and I hope to be able to continue with that as well. I also enjoy it because it gives me the opportunity to be with all members of the Israeli society, who are all giving of themselves for Israel, and I find that to be a very spiritually uplifting experience.
I can now see why your mother is so proud of you. God bless you.
Thank you.
I wanted to make a comment. Just something that you said made me think of this. You said that when you put on your uniform, you're so aware of doing something for Israel, and it made me think of a number of people I know. Well, a few people I know who have lived in Canada for many, many years, over 40 years, but were born or went to Israel when they were babies, grew up in Israel when it was a very difficult time, and the 50s and the 60s, and when they were teenagers, they had to do communal work, etc. What I want to say is that even though now these are people who have made their fortunes, they're doing very well, or they did very well, when they talk about the times that they spent growing up in Israel and what they contributed. It's not that they're thinking, I contributed this, but they're thinking, that time was meaningful. That was a meaningful time. We bonded, we did something. Israel exists also because of my contribution. It's all sort of latent in the conversation, and it's remarkable. It's not how successful they were in Canada, not what house they have or what vacations they have. They always go back to those difficult times in Israel that were the most meaningful of their lives.
Beautiful, beautiful, Gigi. Thank you.
I think, Gigi, you are talking about me. I live,
No, I I know you
I
all.
lived in the Ma'abara, I lived in a tent, I lived in a street, I lived without electricity, without facilities inside. I lived through all those things. Maybe that's why I am so attached to Israel.
But what I find really very, very sad, I mean, it just absolutely demoralizes me, is the fact that many of these Israelis forgot about their religion completely. And when they came to Canada, they didn't understand that they have to do something for their children to understand that they are linked to Israel on a spiritual level. It's not just where their parents are from. And most of these people who, they're very nice, they're lovely people, they care about Israel, they're Zionists, they don't have Jewish grandchildren. Rarely do they have Jewish grandchildren. And I'm very sad about it. I don't know how they feel. I'm not going to ask them, but I feel very badly. They were so, or they are so Israeli, even though they spent so much time here, but they lost it. They didn't understand what they have to, what the challenge of living outside of Israel is in terms of retaining a Jewish identity.
Gigi, you're bringing me back to, well, the time I was in Israel was when I was around 10 years old. I went with my sister. My father sent us to a summer camp. And I remember our camp director, this 80-year-old guy who was so energetic, much more energetic than all of us kids. And he talked to us about the War of Independence. And he's telling us that we were a bunch of, just 8 of us, in a corner building, which had windows on many sides. And they were surrounded by Arabs and artillery. And between the 8 of them, they had only one shotgun.
Wow.
And so he said, we figured it out. We made ropes go from each window to the other. And we kept on, pushing the only thing we had to one window, and then when they finished, we would push it to the other. So they thought there were many people in this little enclave that they had, and stories like that. I don't think Ephraim's story is any different from this one, or all the myriads. And it all goes to show what Ben Gurion said, is that the only way you can understand Israel is through miracle.
A miracle. Well, I think we need one very badly. And
I know.
Ephraim, I don't know, but I assume you must be very aware of the fissure, the rupture in not just in America among Americans, but in the American Jewish community. The Jews are completely divided into, well, Israel has nothing really to do with us. I even know rabbis who are either afraid to speak to their congregations about our connection to Israel. As Rabbi Sachs said, it's one of the pillars. It's one of their ways of being spiritual. It's a homecoming. That we relate to Israel as home, as our spiritual home. They are afraid, or they themselves, these rabbis, do not believe it themselves. And then you have the other Jews, not the majority, who are saying, geez, maybe we have to make Aliyah. So, I mean, there's a real split, and it's sad. It's very, very sad that only 70 years after the Holocaust, only approximately 70 years after the birth of Israel, being Jewish doesn't mean very much to many of them.
Very, very, very well. apropos and very well said, Gigi. Gigi is our past president for the Sisterhood, and she also was co-editor of our Aleinu Bulletin. And she was a teacher of English for many years. So that's why she is so learned, and it just shows whenever she talks. But to your point, I would like to share this with everybody. Ephraim, you and your friends in Israel, on next Thursday, we're going to host Rabbi Manis Friedman of Chabad of Minnesota. Rabbi Friedman, if you listen to him, you'll hear him say, oh, you know, when I was in Israel, I stopped people on the street, you know, and I asked them, who are you? And they would say, oh, I'm an Orthodox. Another one would say, I'm a Haredi. Another one would say, I'm a conservative. And then he asked one guy, he says, who are you? He says, I'm a Jew. He says, where are you from? From Cleveland. And so we should say, we here at the Spanish and Portuguese of Montreal should say, look at us. We're all under one roof, a mini United Nations. As our beautiful history scholar, Sami Surani here has taught us, I mean, he mentioned it, it should ring in our ears every day when we wake up. He said, nationalities were imposed on us. But when it comes down to it, we are Jews with no embellishments. And Rabbi Manis Friedman, he says there were no reform and conservative in Mount Sinai. And when we were all at the foot of the mountain, which is the spirit that people like, individuals like Ephraim and Carol like to inspire, this is our message, those of us who cling to our identity. So I would love to have Rabbi Friedman cheerlead us and encourage us to be proud of who we are, but more than that, to take our message of unity in diversity further beyond the walls of our synagogue, to the world of our Jewish brethren, because there's no more time to be lost. As you just made it so eloquently said, so eloquently expressed, Gigi. And I'm glad you brought up that point, because we need to talk about these things. And we need to have people like Ephraim talk about what he said.
You just mentioned two themes, and my son took it upon himself to make a few videos about the...
Her son is a beautiful cantor in Oregon. Amazing.
But he took it upon himself to make a few videos. One about pride in Jewishness, not reform, not conservative. Exactly what you said. That ultimately you are a Jew. And there was another one, pluralism, diversity. Again, ultimately you're a Jew. There was he made 4 or 5 actually, and another one in which he talks about about Israel as a pillar of our faith, that it's not just a land.
And I keep repeating that phrase that Sami Surani, who is right here on Lydia's iPad, who said, nationalities were imposed upon us. So now we have no more excuses, because we're so well connected, as we can see tonight. I mean, we have the internet, and we can just go back to our common denominator, the Torah. It's that simple. And all this conservative and reform and all this started in Europe in the 1800s, the emancipation, and the Jews didn't want to feel like different from the Christians, so they wanted to ingratiate themselves. But, you know, we should do the opposite. The more we stand tall, just like what we see on Ephraim's screen, stand tall, hold your head up, be a Jew. If you're a chosen, act like one. chosen not because, oh, to have a label, it's chosen because we chose God. And so he chose us. It's a two-way street. We did it. So he said, okay, I will cleave to these guys because they didn't make any conditions. They accepted me just the way I am. So we have to go back to that. But we can't just blame other people. We should educate them. So please join us for Rabbi Manis Friedman on Thursday. I'll send you all the posters, even to Ephraim. And God bless you, Ephraim.
What, if I may
Thank you
make,
very much. I think I'm going to go now. I must.
Okay,
go.
good night.
Lila
It
Tov.
was great to be together with you.
thank you very
Thank you.
much. Toda chava.
Thank
And
you.
yes, be well and succeed, and your children too, and your wife. And I'm very happy to have met you. I once met your lovely mother, and I talked a little bit about, I don't know if you remember this, but about my family's experience in Germany just before the war and after the war. But anyway, I don't know if you remember. And you said, oh, that's something that you should make a movie about. But anyway.
Absolutely. Very important. Let's talk more at another time, but I'd love to talk to you, Gigi.
Okay, thank you.
Awesome.
Good
So
night, honey. I love you.
we all love him.
Yes, I think so. You're our son.
I just wanted to mention, if you weren't there when we said it before, I guess before the recording, Rabbi Shachar Ornstein had an emergency last minute, very, very last minute. And that's why I'm so grateful for Carol to accommodate us. And it's so cool just to see mother and son, and just to see how, if we really want to pass our values to our kids, here's the prime example. And she's not going to stop anytime soon. She's going to keep encouraging, and God bless her. So everybody, God bless you. And thank you so much for joining. It's so nice to see your beautiful faces.
Thank you so much.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you, Sandra. That was a great.
Thank you,
Thank
Sandra.
you, Carol, for joining.
Tina, Lisette, Gladys, Carol, Sammy.
Thank you.
Carol, you're a champ. Thank you.
Thank you very much.